Back to the future. Reinventing a smartphone. Today's smartphones contain disconnected walled gardens and distant islands of functionality. The design principle revolves around that old apocryphal story where Willie Sutton, upon being asked why he robbed banks, proclaimed, "Because that's where the money is." And this is not a design principle. This has nothing to do with invention. The leading operating systems and phone manufacturers have been beat by the little pine phone without much of any effort. And of course, the pine phone operating system, being closer to the pure Linux, is far more powerful. It is not just pine phone. There is also Librem 5 and the Raspberry Pi with a 4G modem, UPS battery and touchscreen, and a custom case. Here we have to think in 4 dimensions. Yes, it will be larger, but with room for extra hardware and the power of a proper desktop. The Raspberry Pi, or any single board computer, SBC, is the modular phone that people don't yet realize they want. But this is not a question of hardware. Hardware is a tough business, as Samsung's exploding batteries teach us. To this day, PinePhone warns that dead pixels on the screen are normal and not to purchase their phones if that will cause a return. Dealing with hardware problems is expensive, and doubly so for companies that do not yet have large financial backing. The Raspberry Pi and the other SBCs are an exception here, because you are buying everything one piece at a time. But this is a question of software. The underlying operating system must be easy to access. The mass-produced smartphone has to boot the same way that a normal computer does. And by trapping the users within some abstraction layer, today's companies destroy that computer. What this means is that the company that will bring the computer back, as in not bother with an alternative GUI, will easily overpower the leading giants. There is no fighting reality. An unrestricted Linux device like the PinePhone or Librem 5 has a lot more to offer than privacy violations, photo leaks, and Candy Crush. They offer real functionality with a world of developers that feel comfortable programming for Linux or BSD. Once the restriction of the simplified graphical shell, like Android or macOS, is removed, the underlying operating system will be exposed to real developers. One of the first things people will program are clones of the leading simplified graphical shells. The simplicity will always be there, but not at restart. It will require the poke of an icon on a real mobile desktop. Android is just an app on the Linux underneath. I'm sure that the developers integrated it deeply into the operating system, and it is now part of the customized Linux underneath, but it is still just a program. These graphical shells for novice users are programs that push away real programmers from programming their own way. They create a market for phones that don't do that, for phones that respect the developers and their choice of languages. That principle of I rob banks because that's where the money is creates a great weakness for leading smartphone manufacturers. While they tend to the flowers of their walled gardens, phones like the Librem 5 and the Pine phone are letting everyone know that the smartphone market isn't actually dominated. There is just a couple of companies in a little corner yelling loudly at the sky while shooting themselves in the foot. We can't really tell what the real phone will look like after a few years. It needs an evolution, not a short-sighted revolution as we have seen thus far. I am an ancient Zorus user. I was already uncomfortable with the GUI shell quirks back in mid-2000s when SL5500 came out. But there were no real restrictions, and I had great fun programming it. Just because not everyone is into programming doesn't mean that unrestricted access to the OS won't benefit them. There will be a lot more programs and a lot more better ideas. We can see some bubbles of potential functionality forming today. The conversational user interface like Siri is an okay-ish idea. A more chat room-like experience with multiple bots would be even better. And there is a friendly programming language emerging already, as demonstrated by IFTTT and Zapier. Though it is far from perfect, it is still somewhat of an improvement over the Automator. These workflows are just pipes, or even less than that. Simple commands, as described by Brian Kernighan in the 1982's The Unix System. It is a lot of user interface just to spell out some commands, but done correctly, it can work. The correct implementation of a GUI-based workflow program is one that just helps with creating Linux command lines or shell scripts. And it works both ways. It can convert shell scripts and one-liners to GUI and back. There is nothing special about this. This has been all thought up decades ago. Except every implementation failed because it had no vision beyond walled gardens and cheap money grabs. It is important to have a round trip from the command line to the GUI and from the GUI back to the command line, because that is how people learn programming. We witnessed something similar in the view source feature of a browser, or the developer console as we have today. Just being able to match the visuals to the code helps a person learn how to use the code. The incentive for using code over GUI is very great, as using the GUI is many times slower. The difference is like dragging words from a dictionary versus actually typing them out. It takes 10 seconds to find the word in a dictionary and 1 second to type it in. Likewise, it takes 10 seconds to find an action in the library of actions and just 1 second to write its name on the command line. Then there are your dot files and user profiles. You want to have one account on your phone for business and another for home. When logged in to both, you can easily switch between the two. Your business account will be connected to your business email and other business-related services, where your home account will be connected to the family email account. This means that different login credentials will exist in both of your profiles. Your business account may use a lot more third-party services, and they have to be kept separate from home-related things. The Automator, IFTTT, and Zapier-like applications will be able to see which services you use and offer different sets of actions. It is very silly that multiple users or profiles can't log into a phone at the same time. A phone based on a multi-user operating system. Frankly, this is embarrassing. As to apps, games, and viruses, walled gardens obscure bugs. Security by obscurity is a bad idea. Everything must be open, and the eyes must be all over the code. That is exactly what Linux has right now. Adding a whole new layer on top of it, even if it is largely open source, just expands the attack surface. The idea of creating a safe app framework has been proven false time and again by apps that stole private information from the phone. Most recently, I heard of a flashlight app doing the stealing. I should also note that creating a single application framework and choosing a single language to create all the apps in is an astonishing display of arrogance, ignorance, and the misunderstanding of the underlying operating system and all the technical revolutions that brought us where we are. One could write a whole miserable book listing all the bad ideas behind that decision. Here, I'll point any lead developers wanting to argue this point to Brian, as he still seems to enjoy elucidating the novice programmer on that point. On a normal Linux system, a weather or flashlight app won't track you. One is a matter of extracting GPS coordinates and making a simple, single HTTP request to a weather service, and the other is a simple system call. There is no app here. There is no middleman grabbing the GPS data, just an HTTP curl request to a weather service dressed up by a local GUI widget, like on a desktop Linux. There is a lot of games that will compile on a standard Linux phone, including emulated ones. There are plenty of frameworks that will do a great job at creating new games. People who want big games need a game console, which also should be open. Consoles of today suffer from the same problem. Customized walled gardens as means of squeezing every cent out of a customer that already paid for the damn thing. Apps is what Linux does, and almost all are free. Certainly all the good ones. That culture of free open source would continue on the pure Linux phone as well. It is a kind of an evolution of Linux, isn't it? There would be no shortage of apps. There would be an increase in contributions and bandwidth donors and mirrors and so on. Predictably, apps, games, and security would be superior to that on leading smartphones of today. And the increase of care and attention would benefit security on both the desktop and the mobile Linux. Today's leading smartphone platforms are just a side road that we will all eventually forget. Had they stayed in the mainstream, their contributions to Linux would be more significant and more valuable, pushing the evolution of Linux beyond what it is today, past a simplified desktop and into a world where the common user can create their own programs. In closing, stay away from hardware, but know that hardware is a simple problem. All that is required to bring about a range of Linux phones is to get them without the extra locks and restrictions that cripple the ability to install standard Linux distributions. Put on a Linux-friendly distribution, and voila! Just like people are buying the Pine phone without any advertising on TV, they would be buying the $100 or $150 no-brand Linux phones that come in different shapes and sizes. And the advertising comes from social media, from word of mouth, a cheap no-brand pure Linux phone that can help the user outprogram most of the apps in walled gardens would spread like a wildfire. In all their programming and years of development, the leading smartphone platforms achieved nothing to beat the 1980s programming powers and ideas. In all their programming, or shall we say madness, they only created more attack vectors and sacrificed user privacy while finding new ways to gag them with ads. The biggest threat to these giants is the bare operating system that they crammed their small-minded ideas on top of. They robbed the bank because that is where the money was. But they also shot themselves in the foot and now have no leg to stand on when facing something as trivial and as cute as the little $150 pine phone.